Well, the clock says it's time to get going, so I'm Marlys Hauck-Fenner, Master Gardener with the Missouri Valley Master Gardeners, and today we're going to talk about pollinator-friendly plantings. The presence of birds, bees, and butterflies in your yard means that it's a healthy, earth-friendly place. And you may have heard of No Mow May. I don't know that Yankton participates in that. The reason we'll talk more about why you may choose not to mow or to mow higher in a little bit. But to me, birds bring a lot of pleasure. Our kitchen window looks out over our backyard. We've got bird feeders back there and trees, and I just, get a lot of pleasure watching the birds out my kitchen window sitting at the table with my binoculars so that I can see them better. You can turn your yard into a perfect habitat that attracts all three of these major types of pollinators by what you plant and what you provide for them. I'm going to be talking about the three major pollinators, which are birds, butterflies, and bees. And they act as pollinators for our garden. Other organisms do some pollinating, but these are by far the most important pollinators. Some of the other pollinators are certain types of flies. A hoverfly is one, and that actually looks a lot like a bee. You might sometimes confuse a hoverfly with a bee. And another one, which I know you deal with in Yankton, are bats. Bats are also pollinators. And you can imagine they've got that hairy body because they're a mammal, so if they're feeding in or near flowers, it's easy for them to brush up against pollen. Okay, Master Gardeners, Missouri Valley Master Gardeners, provide the programming for the seed library. So put out your welcome mat. What is in your yard and what can you add to your yard so that these organisms want to be there? Food sources come from seeds, fruits, nuts, buds, and flowers. Some of them eat the same things as other organisms. Some of them, like butterflies in the caterpillar stage, eat one kind of organism and as the a kind of flower plant, and as a butterfly, another. They also need water. All three of these species need water, both for drinking and for bathing. They need cover, protection from the weather, and protection from predators. They also need a place to raise their young. So it might be a plant to lay an egg on, it might be a tree to put a nest in, but they need somewhere to raise and care for their young. And they need suitable gardening. So planting natives is a good way, and we'll talk more about that later. So let's start with birds. Gardening for birds, of course, we've talked about the food sources, but trees and shrubs are where birds find most of their food, and that's from the fruits, the nuts, the seeds, and then to feed their babies, caterpillars. So even if birds are mostly seed eaters, almost all birds feed their babies, caterpillars. And they really, and if you've ever watched barn swallows, they swoop down and go across the ground and they pick up those insects that fly up out of the grass and the weeds. So most baby birds eat insects. More than 100 species of birds like berries. So if you plant berries, you'll have plenty of birds. Do you want the berries to eat or do you want to give your berries to the birds? You'll have to decide. If you want at least some of the berries, you might have to net your plants. And I have grapes, and the birds, especially the robins, love the grapes. So I net my grapes until I have used all the grapes I want. I make juice and jelly, and then I take the nets off and let the birds finish them off. So we share. But you can do that with things like cherries too, just net them until you have what you want and then share them with the birds. Oak trees are hosts for many caterpillars. They are the best tree host. You might not like caterpillars on your tree, but the oak tree has more species of caterpillars than any other kind of tree. And so they are great for baby bird food. I have a friend who has a vineyard. He supplies grapes for some of the local wineries. And last year we were talking and complaining about all the grasshoppers. He said, I have no grasshoppers. How can that be? He said, well, I don't net my grapes. And he said, the birds are there eating the grapes, and then they're down on the ground picking up the grasshoppers. So another advantage, never knew about. Food sources, perennials and annuals for the seeds and the nectar. Now this morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table and watching the birds. I had some white-crowned sparrows showed up this morning. But the little sparrows were down, and I had my dandelions. I kind of control them. What I won't allow, I dig out. I don't use pesticides. But some of the dandelions have already gone to the fluffy white heads. There's a little sparrow landed sideways on the stem of that dandelion head, bent the dandelion over and sat on the stem, and just had a regular feast out of dandelion seeds. So that was fun to watch. So some of the food, particularly good flowers, Joe Pyeweed, purple coneflower, goldenrod, and penstemon. And these are all native, those four. Birds need shelter. Shrubs, conifers, and vines provide protection and nesting. And the conifers are particularly good because they really have a dense area to build a nest, and the little birds are protected in there. If you've ever had a Cooper's hawk fly across your yard, all of a sudden, the birds are all gone and they're all hiding in those trees.
And dead quiet.
And yes, absolutely, you hear no bird song at that particular time. It is the cycle of life. The Cooper's hawk needs to eat, and it so happens that they do like to eat birds, even though, I wouldn't want them getting a cardinal or something like that. That I really have rarely and really like to watch. The vines, the birds go into the vines, and I happen to show a grapevine there, but a clematis is a vine too. And I have seen a bird nest in the climbing clematis plant. Water is really, really important. It's a magnet for all kinds of wildlife, but birds like it both for bathing and for drinking. Any form of water, a natural stream or spring, a bird bath. There's the top one there is one that you can mount to the rail of your deck. I would not dare do that because I have cats. A low one right on the ground, and then a natural source, like a small pond. Shallow dishes work good. I put a round rock in the middle of my bird bath, and sometimes the birds will sit on that rock in there, and sometimes you'll see butterflies on that rock, and they are able to get water by sitting on the rock. If you have bird baths in the winter time, heat them, and the birds really, really love that because that's their only source of water in the winter time. Located in an open area where a predator can't hide and jump out and get the birds at the bird bath. So they like to be near trees. So if that Cooper's hawk comes over while they're in the bird bath, they've got trees to go to. But if you have it too close to the trees, then the predators can be in the trees and bother the birds. Native plants are important. A lot of them are tolerant to drought. That's why they grow here. You know, natively, that's why they grow here. They're low maintenance. You don't have to do a lot with them. Some are self-seeding, some are perennials that come back. They provide building supplies like twigs, pieces of dry grass. The main thing about natives is they have symbiotic bonds with the local birds and insects. In other words, over time, they developed together. You may have heard John Ball, the state forester, talk about why we have problems with things like emerald ash borers, and it's because our native trees can't tolerate these pests that come from other countries. Emerald ash borers are not a problem in China, where they came from, because the trees there are adapted to having those emerald ash borers, and it does not kill them. So that applies to us here too. What grew up here and is adapted to our climate is also adapted to our insects and the birds that eat the things that these trees provide. So search for local natives. You can go to www.nwf, which is nationalwildlifefederation.org, and search for the native plant finder. You put in your zip code and it will give you a list of native plants. Prairie Moon Nursery is a native plant nursery. You can buy both seeds and plants. And if you wanted today, you were given a list of native plant seeds that we have here. But this comes out of Minnesota, so that would be considered native. And I enjoy looking through this. And some of the native flowers are really, really very beautiful. So here's ironweed, false indigo, Maximilian sunflower. All of those are native. All of them flower. And some of them also have caterpillars that live on them. Some birds are pollinators, but the bird that is most going to be a pollinator for you would be a hummingbird, because they're always in and around the flowers. Other birds, not quite as much. Now, hummingbirds actually obtain their nutrition by eating the small bugs that live on the flowers. And they get their energy from the nectar that they drink out of the flowers. So in that respect, having native flowers and real flowers for the hummingbirds is better than having a bird feeder with the syrup in it. They like red, or things in the red family like pink, orange. They like tube-shaped flowers, as you can see in this picture. They like flowers with less fragrance. So they're not attracted by the fragrance. They're attracted by the shape and the color of the flower. They like cascading blooms, something that they can put their head up to drink. Plant in clusters. So don't just plant one plant of something, but plant 3 or 4. And plant in varying heights so that they can go up here and then down here and flip from flower to flower. You may see ruby-throated hummingbirds during migration and in the warmer months. The female is all green. The male has a little bit of red on it. It's not impossible that you would ever see a rufous hummingbird. They're sort of coppery looking, but you would see them only during migration for a very short period of time, and they are very aggressive. So they will fight with each other, and they'll try to chase away any other hummingbird that is in the area. To keep the blooms going, deadhead, cut off the blooms that are spent. Now, some sweet treats because they have a lot of nectar, and these are in order. So I keep wanting to point on here. You can't see that. Going from the top down, bee balm, butterfly weed, columbine, and obviously not all of these are native, but hummingbirds do like them because of their shape. And then starting over here, fuchsia, salvia, and snapdragon. They all have those sort of tube-shaped flowers that they can hover there and stick their beak into. If you are feeding at feeders, do not use the red syrup that you buy. Make your own. It's very easy. It's just sugar water. Never use honey. And it's 1/4 cup white sugar to 1 cup boiling water. Stir it up real good. Let it sit until it's cool, and then fill your feeder with it, and make sure you clean your feeder at least every 3 days so there's no bacteria or anything growing in it. Okay, that's birds. Bees. Some of you who got here early got a little folder with the picture of a lot of native bees on it and a pack of seeds that has native wildflowers. Bees pollinate about 75% of our food crops. So they are very, very important in producing food for us and for animals. The majority of the pollination is done by native bees. So of the bees, about 80% of the pollination is done by native bees, not by the honeybees. Honeybees are making honey for themselves, and they're pollinating as a byproduct of that. Native bees are often small and may resemble flies. You might not be able to tell them apart. Now, the difference, if you can get close enough to look at it, is that bees have 4 wings and flies only have 2. But sometimes the bees' wings are hooked together, so it looks like they have 2. If you want to watch any kind of insect, make sure that when you approach it, your shadow is behind you. Because as soon as your shadow goes across any kind of insect, they're gone. So keep your shadow behind you. There are over 400 species of native bees in South Dakota. And some of them are only like 1/4 of an inch. They're very, very tiny. 20 to 45% of native bees are pollen specialists. That means they pollinate only one kind of plant. And we'll look at a couple of those in a little bit. Most bees are solitary. Most of them do not live in groups. Honeybees, which we always think of when we think of bees, are social insects. That's why they live in a hive and they cooperate with each other. You know, the queens and the workers and the drones, they all have their own jobs to do. But some of them are solitary. They just do their own thing all by themselves until it's mating time. And many of them live either underground or in hollow stems. So they don't have a hive out there that you can see. You may have been working in your flower bed or working in your garden and you see a hole about that big with little loose dirt around it. That's a ground-dwelling bee or a ground-dwelling wasp. but you leave them alone and they won't have anything to do with you. So those are some of the native bees there. I'll get into better pictures later. Bees need both nectar and pollen. Choose a range of flower shapes and colors. They're not as fussy as hummingbirds are. And I have seen bees on my dandelions already this spring. Plant long season blooms, or plant a variety starting in early spring all the way into fall. They need earliest flowers, pussy willows and dandelions. That's the very earliest flowers there are, and they'll get after them as soon as they can find flowers. If you're looking at your own flowers that you have available, look for gaps in the season. Do you ever have a time when you don't have anything in bloom? If that's the case, try to find something that you could plant that would fill in that gap so that these bees continuously have a food source. Again, choose non-hybrid natives and avoid double flowers. If they have lots of petals, they're harder to get nectar from. One example, I bought an echinacea that didn't just look like a daisy. You know, it didn't have the center and then the petals. It had little tiny petals sticking up all over in there. And that happened to be a hybrid, but it only lived for one season, and I never saw any kind of bird, butterfly, or bee around that particular plant. So plant in masses. They don't like flying long distances to find just one flower. So, you know, if you've got a couple of flowers here and a couple of flowers way over there, that's a lot of work. So plant them in clusters and plant them fairly close together. What else do bees need? They need nesting sites. They like undisturbed ground. That's why in my garden is disturbed ground, but I always find those ground dwelling bees in my garden, and I just steer clear. They look really scary because they're pretty big, but they also like vegetation and they like dry stems. They actually lay their eggs inside those dry stems, and sometimes little ones go in there for protection. At the end of the season, when you're cleaning up, leave your stems so that the bees can actually live in them or lay their eggs in them. And in the spring, do your cleanup late. Or if you want to do your cleanup early, then cut the stems off close to the ground, tie them up together, and hang them in a tree. Or you can also use fallen wood, brush piles, and old fence posts hidden away. And those are great nesting sites for bees too. They like muddy or sandy areas for water. So they're not going to drink out of the bird bath, but they will sit on that damp sand and lap up water out of that. And this bottom picture here shows you there's a little bit of water on one side, some rocks in there, and then some sand, wet sand in there for the bees. The middle picture shows you those empty stems that the bees can use. And then on the far right, you might recognize that's actually a mason bee house that you can buy those at Menards or different garden centers, and the mason bees will nest in those. But you can create your own with dry stems. Okay, we always hear about the problems with bees and how bees are declining and bees are dying and bees aren't healthy. A lot of it is due to climate change. So the flowers and the bees are out of sync because of climate change. They're not coming out at the same time that they used to. And the bees, when they emerge, they need to have that food source. There's loss of habitat due to herbicides. You know, we used to have milkweeds all over the ditches out in the country, and you don't see very many anymore because the herbicides that are being used in agriculture are killing off all those weeds, even the ones that help the bees and the butterflies. Then the biggest problem of all is the use of very toxic pesticides, especially what are called neonicotinoids. And the problem with them is they are systemic. So they go through the whole plant, they stay in the plant for its entire life, and they even end up staying in the soil. So what that means, if a milkweed manages to grow in that soil that it had the neonicotinoid in it the year before, it may pick up that toxic chemical, and if the monarchs try to live on that milkweed, it may kill them. These neonicotinoids are probably not the pesticides that you are going to use in your garden. They are the ones that are used in agriculture. The seeds are treated with the neonicotinoids. The corn and the bean seeds, you can't buy, I don't think you can even buy seed corn that's not like bright pink. And that's these chemicals on the seed. Lawn treatments, the lawn treatment that contains neonicotinoids or could is your grub killers. So you can get grub killers now that do not contain neonicotinoids. So if you're going to treat your lawn for grubs or you're going to have someone else do it for you, make sure that you check the label and choose not to use the neonicotinoids. And one thing that I found when I was doing my research here is that some nurseries spray their plants with neonicotinoids. And if you take those home and plant them, well, then there's your pollinator plant that's loaded with toxic chemicals. And if the bees try to use that flower, sorry, there they go. You can ask at the nursery when you buy your plants if they have been sprayed and what they have been sprayed with. Now, that's not why I start all my own plants, but it's a good reason for doing that. So take your seeds home and start your own plants. And because of all these other problems, the climate change and their lack of food and not being able to find food sources, and then finding food sources but they're toxic, that's what's contributing to the diseases that the bees get because they're so stressed out and unhealthy. Okay, here's some South Dakota native bees, and since we have 400 some different varieties, I'm not going through all of them, but these are the most common ones that you might actually see. So the digger bee is a hairy bee, and it's a ½ to an inch long. This is the kind that you could see in the garden, in those little holes, and they live underground. Leafcutter bees are 1/4 to a ½ inch long. They cut circles out of your leaves, and I've seen them cut out of my rose leaves. They seem to like rose leaves really well. And the reason that they're doing that is they take those little circles of leaf back to their nest and they use it to line their nest. And these bees carry pollen on the undersides of the body. So some bees have pollen baskets on their back legs, which you may have seen if you watch a bee and it's in your apple flowers and their back legs are just big round balls of yellow pollen. But this bee is hairy and carries the pollen on its hairy little body. Longhorn bees, if you see one of those, you'll recognize it by its funny colored eyes. So its eyes are real light colored. They nest underground and they are a specialist. So you will find them on asteraceae plants, such as sunflowers, things that have a center and then petals around it. Mason bees are the ones that have the reputation for doing a lot of pollinating. And you want them around your fruit trees if you have fruit trees. They are only a 1/2 to 3/4 inch long, and they have metallic bodies. Now, doesn't that one look like a fly? So you may have seen them and just thought it was a fly. It's actually a bee. They nest in wood or hollow plant stems, and they're the ones that you can buy the houses for. Mason bee houses with the hollow little tubes in them. Someone was asking me before we got started about buying mason bees. And yes, you can buy mason bees. You can order them from seed companies and different places, nurseries. Amanda Bachman, our urban entomologist for South Dakota, recommends that you do not do that because you want them to be acclimated to where you live and native to where you live. So if you want to attract mason bees, give them a good habitat that they want to move in. So they're going to need a place to nest. And that's either your bunches of twigs or a mason bee house or whatever. And there's always a few around. And so if you provide them with a good home, they'll move in there and they'll probably stay and you'll get a bigger number of mason bees. Mining bees, you can tell by that name that they live underground. They like sandy soil. Another small bee, 1/4 to 1/2 inch. They have dark bodies and a hairy thorax. So you can kind of see in that picture how hairy it looks. Small carpenter bees, 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Another one that looks a lot like a fly. They have dark metallic bodies and they also nest in hollow twigs and plant stems. Squash bees, I'll bet you've seen this if you raise squash, cucumbers, melons. These are specialists. That's what they pollinate. So you're not going to see a squash bee trying to pollinate echinacea or something. You see them early in the morning. If you go to your garden, you'll see a bunch of bees in those big squash flowers, and they look a lot like honeybees. So probably that's what you thought they were, but they're more than likely squash bees. And they are about the size of a honeybee, about a 1/2 inch. They also live underground in tunnels. Sweat bees, you probably thought these were annoying little flies. They're 1/4 to 1/2 inch long, so tiny. Metallic green head and thorax. They're attracted to sweat. So when you're working out in the yard, you're working out in the garden, you're perspiring, you may have these little green flies that keep buzzing around. Well, they're not actually a fly. They're probably a sweat bee. And they like rotting logs for nesting. Bumblebees. They're up to an inch. I'm sure you probably have all seen a bumblebee. They are hairy with black and bodies with patches of yellow. They're a very big bee. They're the bee that the Song of the Bumblebee was written about because they're not supposed to be able to fly given the size and shape of their body. They are social bees. They live in underground colonies. Now, the one on the right, the middle bee, can you see that rusty stripe in the middle of its body? Those are rusty rumped bees, and they are almost extinct. So if you see one of them, that's going to be a pretty special thing. Honeybees are non-native. They're about a 1/2 inch. They come from Europe. And they are the ones that we associate with the honey that we eat because that's what they do. They are brown with bands of pale hairs, and that one doesn't really show it there, but they're the ones that have the pollen baskets on their back legs. And I'm not sure if that little yellow spot right there is a pollen basket or not. It's kind of hard to tell in the picture. But they are social bees and they live in a colony. And if you don't provide a hive for them, they'll find one of their own in the walls of a building or something like that. Okay, butterflies. Some of the same things as we've seen with our other animals. They need food sources. And because butterflies go through complete metamorphosis, their young are completely different than the adult butterfly. The young are caterpillars. They need different kinds of host plants. The butterflies need different plants than the caterpillars need. So the butterflies need nectar-producing plants, and early in the spring, I have seen butterflies around already. They need water in the wet sand. They lap it up with their proboscis, and they need shelter. And the shelter is places to roost at night, and they are active during the day. Moths are active at night. They like tree crevices and leaf litter, which is where their young pupate over the winter. So they go from a caterpillar to that pupa, and that's how they overwinter. And then in the spring, when the weather conditions are right, they come out as a butterfly. Have any of you ever had the luck of seeing the migrating monarchs congregate on a tree in your yard? Yeah. Well, that's their shelter. That's their place of protection. Their place to rest for the night. Yes.
Like the butterfly bushes especially.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why they have their name.
Yeah.
Yeah. South Dakota is host to about 180 species. So, you know how people have bird lists? I don't know if anybody has a butterfly list, but it would be about the same thing. Keystone trees. These are really, really important trees for butterflies because they provide shelter. They have the kind of bark that has crevices in it, and they have the leaves that caterpillars like so that the butterflies can lay their eggs on these leaves, and then the caterpillars eat. And remember, going back to the birds, then the bird parents come along and grab those caterpillars and use it to feed their babies. So chokecherry, which you may see growing wild, birds plant it. They sit on the fence, you know, and the chokecherry actually has a pretty good sized seed in it. And so where they drop that seed with its little pile of fertilizer, you might get another chokecherry tree. But if you like chokecherry jelly, you have to watch those trees very carefully because the birds love those berries and they're probably going to know exactly when they're ripe and get them before you do. Willows are another tree that is good for butterflies. And also remember that they have the little catkins that are some of the earliest flowers that the bees like. And then the oak is absolutely considered the best tree there is for this wildlife. And we have the two recommended are bur and chinkapin. I wanted to plant an oak tree this year, and I really kind of wanted to plant a chinkapin until I read about it. And I live 20 miles north of here, and believe it or not, I am in a different planting zone. And the chinkapin would be okay in Yankton. It would not be okay for me up there living in the wide open country where I have nothing protecting me from the wind and it gets really, really cold, colder than it does in a town. And so I got a bur oak, and we just planted that the other day. So I'll never live long enough to see that tree get big, but the reason these are called keystone trees is because they attract multiple species and they provide nectar when they bloom, and they serve as host plants for the caterpillars. So what are some nectar producing flowers? Not all of these are natives, but they still are a good nectar source. Asters, coneflowers, these are in order. Lantana, marigold, salvia, zinnia. And I plant a lot of zinnias in my garden because they are also good for attracting the pollinators. And I like that in my garden. And I sometimes have seen just hundreds of butterflies on my zinnias. Butterflies also like overripe fruit, and so do some of your birds, like orioles, like fruit, oranges particularly. Bananas, strawberries, oranges are favorite. And there's the butterfly on a slice of an orange. And keep ants away by setting the dish of fruit in water. And then the ants won't go through the water to get all over the fruit. But change the fruit daily. Host plants for butterflies. These are for their caterpillars, and these vary by species. So find out which host plants your favorite butterflies prefer and make sure that you have those around. Avoid butterfly bush because it may become invasive. So common milkweed, not tropical milkweed, but common milkweed or swamp milkweed is preferred by monarchs. The adults like the nectar in the flowers, but it's particularly important for egg laying and raising caterpillars on the milkweed plants. And you may have heard within the last year of the danger that the monarchs are in. They're really, really declining in numbers. So if we can plant, and again, plant in a clump, and then try to encourage your neighbors to do the same thing so that the butterflies don't have to go across town to try to find a plant. Dill, parsley, and even carrot tops for eastern swallowtails. And that's the top picture. So if you have dill, you've probably seen these. I let the dill go wild in my garden because I love those black swallowtail butterflies. And that's what I've been doing the last 2 days. I've been scuffle hoeing out all my dill that I don't want for the next year, because when you let it seed itself, you get a lawn of dill in your garden. Butterflies like grasses and sedges. Some of them may be hosts for the larvae to live on, but even better, they're good for pupation because they have places where that caterpillar can hang itself up and turn into a pupa. And there's also a lot of shelter, and at the base of these plants, a lot of sites for the pupa to overwinter and come out the next spring. Some native choices of grasses are, the top one is Indian grass, which turns a real pretty rusty red in the fall. And the bottom is little blue stem, which is a clump grass. And prairie dropseed, which is also a clump grass, but it's really pretty because the leaves, you can see how they kind of go down. They don't stick straight up. Some common South Dakota butterflies. Remember, there's 140. I'm only showing you 6. And I tried to pick ones that I thought you would probably recognize. The azure is only about that big, and you might see them on mud. So they like to get their water out of mud. The American painted lady, the cabbage white, the eastern swallowtail, one of my favorites, the monarch, and a variegated fritillary. Now, if you, I thought about bringing my field guides along. I have field guides for birds and butterflies and insects, and you can look these up or you can go online, and it's amazing how close you can get if you type in just the characteristics. So if you say 1-inch butterfly, blue color, just put in the characteristics and see what comes up. And then you look at the pictures and you see, oh yeah, that looks exactly like the butterfly that was out there. You can do the same thing with field guides, which are books specific to one species, like butterflies. Now, let's say you don't have a big yard. I mean, I live on a farm. We've got a huge yard. But maybe you don't. Maybe you have a very small yard and you would like to plant something for pollinators, but you don't know how to begin. How do I, in my small area, do any good with trying to plant some pollinators? Well, that diagram there is just a 4x6 oval. Plant clumps of native pollinators in full to partial sun. Leave some open ground in case you've got some ground nesting bees that want to be in there. Provide a water source. And if you're looking at mostly insects, then you probably want that to be like a pan of wet sand or something. Avoid pesticides. And if you don't even have this much space, try a grouping of container plants. So this is 5 different plants that you can put in a cluster outside your house and try to do what you can for pollinators, even if you have very small areas. So this is Indian blanket, anise hyssop, orange coneflower, purple coneflower, and lance leaf coreopsis. And what you can see about those particular ones is the shape of the flowers. They're almost all the same, except for the hyssop.
Are those all perennials? No.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
I have about 3 or 4 of them seeds in the back here.
Okay.
3 or 4.
Now, this is a list of 22 plants that provide something for all 3 species, birds, bees, and butterflies. So if you don't plant anything else, you plant some of these, birds, bees, and butterflies will get some value from them. Bee balm, like sun to part shade. And when I talk about average soil, I'm talking about average moisture, not real dry and sandy, not real wet and boggy. It blooms in midsummer, and we want those blooms all year long.
Is horse mint and bee balm the same?
I don't know. Does anybody know that?
Did you say horse?
Horse mint? I don't know.
Horse mint.
I can try to look that up. I'll get my phone out here afterward. Oh, Suzanne's looking? Okay. It blooms in midsummer, and I'm giving you maximum heights on these because we want plants of different heights too. A lot of wildflowers are really fairly tall. They're not real short little plants. Echinacea likes sun. It likes average soil moisture, blooms in the summer, and can get up to 4 feet tall. And that one, the purple one, is the one that is native to here. You can buy a lot of different colors in nurseries, but this is the one that's native to here. And again, not all of these plants of these 22 are native plants. Goldenrod. Okay, like sun to part shade, average soil moisture, blooms late summer to fall. Grandma always said 6 weeks after the first goldenrod blooms, it will freeze. I have tried to watch that and I don't believe Grandma. Because sometimes the goldenrod starts blooming really early, and I certainly would not want frost at the end of August or the first week of September. And it can get up to 6 feet tall. A lot of what I see in the ditch does not get that tall.
Yeah, in Minnesota, it's in the ditches everywhere.
Yeah.
State flower of Nebraska.
Oh. Globe,
Not 6 feet.
goldenrod. Well, that's what I just did, right? The thistle, like sun to part shade, average to wet soil. It blooms in summer to fall, so this one extends a little bit longer, and it's up to 4 feet tall.
They are the same thing.
So
Horse mint is another name for Monarda punctata.
okay, so we learned something today. Thank you.
I never heard of horse mint, so.
I grew up knowing it as horse mint, so.
Around here?
Yeah.
Oh.
Interesting. Never heard of.
Yeah, because usually regionally we have different names for things, but. Okay, hollyhock is actually a biennial, and we have hollyhock seeds, don't we? Yeah. If you plant it now, you will not get flowers this year. You will get just a plant, green plant. Next year, it comes back and blooms. And once it blooms, then it reseeds itself. So then you'll be getting, after a period of years, you'll be getting hollyhocks every year because some are in their green stage and some are in their blooming stage. They like sun and they like average moisture soil, and they are up to 8 feet tall.
Wow.
Lavender, like sun and dry soil, it blooms in the summer and gets about 3 feet tall.
That's not always very hardy here, I don't think.
No, I think we're on the very border edge of lavender being able to grow well here. Liatris, sometimes called blazing star, like sun, dry to moist soil, and it blooms in the summer and can get up to 6 feet tall. Sedum grows in sun to partial shade, likes average soil, it's about 2 feet tall, and Autumn Joy, the variety, is a favorite, and it's probably because of its color. Sunflower, sun to partial shade, likes average to dry soil. It's a late summer to autumn bloomer, and it can get to 8 feet tall. Sweet peas are sun to partial shade, average to dry soil. They vine, and their vines can get 12 feet long. So they will need a fence or trellis or something to hold them up.
When did they bloom?
Sweet peas in the summer. Zinnias, like sun, average soil. They bloom from summer into fall, and they get to be about 3 feet tall. Clematis, like sun to part shade, average to dry soil. It blooms early summer to early fall, and it can climb to 20 feet. So again, you need a trellis or a fence or something to support it.
Yeah, and there's varieties that are lesser than.
Yes, yeah, there's all kinds of varieties. Bush type, yeah. If you'll notice how dense the foliage is on that vine, that's why that's a really good place to hide if you're some kind of little organism. Scarlet runner bean, and these are actually edible. The beans are. They like full sun. They like moist, well-drained soil. They bloom in the late summer. And again, you need a support for these because their vines can get about 9 feet long. Choke berry is not choke cherry. If you'll notice the scientific name, Aronia, that's what we call them around here. And maybe it's to distinguish them from choke cherries. I don't know why. But they are actually what we call Aronia berries. And these are good for us to eat too. They're very healthy. They taste horrible fresh. So you have to, what they do, and the people who raise Aronia berries, they freeze the berries. And then they use them to make juices and stuff like that. And Aronia berry lemonade is really, really good.
It supposedly has a lot of health benefits.
Lots of health benefits, yes. They like sun to partial shade, moist soil. They bloom late spring. They fruit late summer. And they only get shrub size, so about 6 feet tall. The choke cherry you're most likely to find in the wild. And that has those beautiful blackberries in little strings. They grow kind of in strings. Makes wonderful juices, syrups, and jellies for those of us who like that kind of stuff. It likes sun, average moisture soil. It blooms in the late spring and fruits in the latter part of the summer. And these trees can actually get to be 30 feet tall, if they get old enough. The dogwood likes sun to part shade, moist soil, and it can get up to 36 feet tall, but I don't know that the ones that grow around here get that tall. Elderberry, those flower in what they call umbrels. It's like an umbrella, and there's all these little flowers on there. And then that's how the berries look too. It likes sun to shade, moist soil, and it can get 20 feet tall, and it blooms and produces its fruit in mid to late summer. Lilacs like sun to partial shade. They like average moisture soil, about 12 feet tall, and they don't have fruit that are edible, but they have very nice flowers, and the leaves are desirable to some caterpillars. Mountain ash, you may have seen these trees around. They have those clusters of orange berries on them. They like sun to light shade, average moisture soil. They can get 50 feet tall. They bloom in the spring, and they produce berries, which the birds would like in the winter time. So there's a winter food source. Also, some of your little tiny crab apples that hang on to their fruit provide fruit for birds in the wintertime. Pussy willows, or willows in general, they like sun to part shade. They like wet to average soil, and they bloom in the early spring. The red bud likes sun to shade, average moisture soil, one of the first bloomers in the spring, and they're really unique because the little flowers are right on the stems, and they are an important source of spring pollen. like the willows and the dandelions.
They're blooming now. aren't
Yeah, they're blooming now. And they get up to 30 feet tall. And I've never noticed a red bud after it doesn't bloom anymore, so I don't, I mean, they're just like any other tree then. Their claim to fame is their early pink flowers all along the stems of the tree. Service berry, like sun to partial shade, average soil. It blooms early in the spring. It has berries in the summer, and birds love those berries. It can get up to 40 feet tall. So there's 22 plants that are liked by all three species that we talked about today. There's my bibliography. I brought my books along with me if you'd like to look at them. Here's the little pamphlet on pocket pollinators that was developed in Illinois. And then there's some articles here on bees and neonicotinoids. So you can access any of those again by going to the library website. Along the side, there'll be a menu and the seed library will be on there. And all of these presentations are there for you, even going back a long time, since the seed library started. And so if you're looking for more information to read, checking out the bibliography page on the presentations would be a good way to go. Okay, any questions?